Okay, yeah. So today I'm going to talk about an aspect of my PhD research that is I completed about 5 or 6 years ago now. Apologies if I start to get a little bit lost in this because I've not really engaged with it for quite a while. So, but when I was asked to do a talk for the SIG, I thought, well, this would be a reasonable topic, and hopefully it'll stimulate a bit of debate amongst everyone. So I'm more than happy to get people's thoughts on it, and you can pull it to pieces, and let's, I'm happy to have a discussion on it in a chat or at the end of the talk. So yeah, this is just one aspect of my research, but which went down many rabbit holes, and but yeah, the core aspect of my research was trying to find out aspects of changing continuity in the landscape of Northumberland, southeast Northumberland, I should say, which is on this image here. You're going to see a lot of maps with lines on, so yeah, I'll try and explain all those as best I can. So a bit of context into why I wanted to do this. It's basically I was an archaeologist working in southeast Northumberland, excavating numerous Iron Age settlements, early medieval settlements with associated boundary systems. And while I was digging these features, I remember thinking, how do these fit into sort of, what we might call the early modern and modern landscapes? What can we use to sort of try and identify aspects of where these former landscapes might have endured? So that became my PhD topic, really. I drew on a lot of existing studies, Tom Williamson, Steve Rippon, who've looked at this kind of thing, and obviously going way further back than that. I was finding that a lot of the earlier studies, because of the lack of technology then and other things, were very much based on interpretation by eye, and I wanted to try and build a robust digital model for calculating orientation and slope conformity and analysing patterns within that as well. So it's very GIS based. So again, I will apologise for the amount of graphs and that kind of thing in here. So towards the end of the research, I realised that this kind of approach has been done as well for the Inglal project, and that it's a very. I think the methodology is pretty close to mine, but mine, I'd like to think that mine had a specific modus operandi of looking at the landscape of southeast Northumberland, which is relatively underrepresented in these studies, and also trying to tease out from first edition Ordnance Survey maps how and whether there's any features in that landscape that have endured from earlier periods, which we know there probably are, but it's trying to find out where they are and what they might be related to. So that there's some pretty clear chronological gaps in the archaeological record in Northumberland, and these partly may be a result of the nature of excavations in that area in the area. Obviously, commercial archaeology is led by where the developments occur, and that's what we have to go on. So we've got a massive amount of Iron Age activity in southeast Northumberland, characterised by late Iron Age, early Romano-British enclosed settlements, which are rectilinear, usually surrounded by field systems. We think that the research shows that a lot of these fell out of use around the middle of the 2nd century with the coming of the Roman regime and Hadrian's Wall. Some endured, probably, but the density of these settlements seems to have dropped, and excavation evidence shows that a lot of them were just stopped being in use by that time. We've we've got a bit of a gap then, obviously, up until the 7th century, where we've got an early medieval settlement complex at Shotton, where we've got unenclosed halls, enclosed halls. Then it seems to have gone out of use in the 9th century at Shotton. We can't, obviously, we're dealing with limited excavation data, especially in terms of the early medieval period. We've then got a potential gap between that and the 12th century, when we know that there was a proliferation of nucleated medieval villages in Northumberland, the layout of which is encased in loads of existing settlements now, which we know about. So they're the perceived gaps that we've got at the moment, real or imagined, we don't know. But they're the things that I was trying to find out about, what endured through these gaps, what was taken away. So my approach was to take multiple sources of data, excavation reports, data, digital data from those, which I was very kindly given by the HER for Northumberland and for Tyne and Wear. The first edition Ordnance Survey map, I undertook a lot of transcription of that, which I'll get into in a minute. Nearly went crazy. Remote sensing data, so LiDAR, Google Earth, aerial photography and geophysical surveys, where the features were robust enough to be interpreted as being Iron Age or Mono-British. And now these were all plotted digitally in GIS, so they could then be units of measurement for analysing the orientations. So yeah, it was based on linear features, so rectilinear settlement enclosures, dated. I'm calling them ancient boundaries or tracts. By that I mean the boundaries and trackways that are likely to be late Iron Age, early Mono-British. Roman roads, Hadrian's Wall, medieval ridge and furrow, post-medieval ridge and furrow, which I'd teased out on morphological grounds, and then obviously all the boundaries and tracts represented on the first edition Ordnance Survey mapping. So the rule of thumb was, if it's linear, I'm mapping it, and these were all the relevant attributes were added to these features to be able to tease out what was what. Other research questions were obviously, once you've got all this data, what does it mean? What are you going to sort of say about it? So my PhD research, but I'm not really going to get into this kind of aspect of it today. But it was trying to understand the factors that led to these particular orientations being used and the particular conformity to slope. So whether it's the natural environment, the climate, cosmology, or a combination of everything, So yeah, I haven't got time to get into all that today, so I'll crack on. So yeah, here's the study area, southeast Northumberland. The River Tyne is this darker line here. This is a digital terrain model of the area that we're looking at. So as you can see, all these lines here, I don't know if you can see my cursor as I'm scrolling over this, but these are all the boundaries and trackways, linear features on the first edition Ordnance Survey map, which I painstakingly mapped. And you might think, are you okay? And yeah, it probably affected me for life doing all that. But I think I got a bit lost in doing all this, but it was necessary. And I've since found out that there's AI methods now to do all this, which I kind of wish I had not found out about, because this is the general lie of the land in the study area I'm looking at. So it's the Northumberland coastal plain, relatively low lying. This is from a village called Earsden in North Tyneside, looking over towards the sea there. So it's gently rolling hills on a coastal plain for the most part. As we get further west, the land does rise naturally into the valleys of the River Reed and the River North Tyne. So yeah, as I said in an earlier slide, it was a case of transcribing multiple features. You've seen all those I did on a first edition map. I've also transcribed the orientations of rectilinear settlement enclosures, which is shown up here on LiDAR, post-medieval ridge and furrow, that kind of thing. Anything on, I've got a bunch of APs mapped, whatever I could off there. This is just a pretty image showing the sort of variety of data that of imagery that I've used to gather that data set. So yeah, once I got all these lines transcribed, it became apparent that obviously not all field boundaries are dead straight, and they turn. In that way, you cannot measure the orientation of a single field boundary because it varies. So to sort of combat that, to get over that, I used aspect imagery, which derives from a 50-meter resolution digital terrain model. And what that basically does is every single 50-meter square is assigned the aspect of slope that the slope runs in. So I then built a grid over the aspect imagery, and that grid became the unit to split all these lines. So yes, it means artificially splitting the whole boundaries, but that was the only way that I could think of at the time of returning statistically robust data that could be measured. So that was the approach that I took for the entire data set. And obviously, to calculate all these orientations, to do those individually would be impossible, really, in the time that I had. So I used some trickery in ArcGIS at the time to build what's called a model to run multiple processes one after the other. So you basically it basically means I'm merging together features, I'm clipping features to certain points. I have to admit here, it's been that long since I've engaged with this model. I'm struggling to remember all these steps. But what it means is you go from a certain point, say this is post-medieval ridge and furrow that you're feeding in. So you feed in that and the 50-meter grid. That then creates the green thing. The green thing is the output of this as the tool. I don't want to get too much into this because I get it. It's pretty boring, maybe. So it basically means that you press play and it runs through all these processes until you get this at the end, and that is your data of the orientation and the how it relates to the underlying slope. So then it became, once I'd done all that, I got all the data sets done. It became a process of looking at what constituted a reasonable threshold for conformity to underlying slope. And I could have gone with, it 100% conforms. That would have been a relatively small data set, because of the nuances of the landscape. I decided to go with a slightly higher threshold, so I went within 20 degrees of underlying slope. And while I was doing that, I was sort of cross-checking against contour maps like I'm doing here. So these blue lines, which are field boundaries, are all the ones that conform to within 20 degrees of the underlying slope direction. And the pink, or peach as it's come out in this picture, is to within 30 degrees of the underlying slope direction. So it's all. I went with 20 through discussions with my supervisor, and we decided that was a reasonable threshold to go with that would return meaningful results. So what I was trying not to do was look for certain trends, and I wanted to let the data sort of guide this rather than going, well, okay, there's certain orientations that I'm interested in, that I want to try and make, shoehorn into this. And I tried not to do that. I tried to just make it very objective in terms of the output of the processes. But I was finding there was more conformity to underlying slope the further west we went, which probably would make sense because there was more upland zone. It was more of an upland zone up there. So in terms of the data, the scale of the data, and in terms of how that feeds into the analytical process, I suppose it's worth noting that we've got in the tens of prehistorical Roman boundaries to hundreds, which are the rectilinear enclosures, thousands of units of ridge and furrow, and hundreds of thousands of units for the boundaries and tracts mapped on first edition OS map. And obviously that's done to, those units are based on the 50-meter resolution aspect. So, for example, if I've just did a quick calculation there. If you were to use a 5-meter resolution aspect model, which possibly could give you more and more accurate results, that would the data set just keeps, it's like 2 million points, which I think in terms of managing the data, I had to have a cutoff point, and that's what I went with in the end. So this is a map which looks a bit yucky of the sort of like a heat map almost of conformity to underlying slope direction. So the red shows where there's greater conformity, and the white is where it's less conformity. And obviously there's colours in between, the pinky colours in between. So when you look at it at this scale, it's quite, you can't really pull too much out of it. You've got this area around here, which I think is around the River Reed. There's a few areas, a few patches of areas where there's greater conformity, obviously along the River Tyne, which isn't surprising. But I was finding at this scale it was quite difficult and this level, this sort of mode of analysis wasn't really that helpful. I looked at it in terms of major rivers in the region. Again, it sort of just teases out what I've just said there. There's more, you can see more heat, if you like, around the river basins. Then started looking at other units of data, which so for example the township shown on tide maps and first edition OS maps, and that's where I started to think, hang on, there are a few areas where there is greater conformity, and sometimes it's contained more closely within a township boundary. So, for example, this township of Horton over here towards the coast, I thought, it looks more red. I mean, that's not to, I'll pull up some numbers to sort of, and some more detailed mapping to show that in a sec. So obviously there's, in most cases, there is a conformity in some description, but it's teasing out to what degree that is. So yeah, we'll zoom in a little bit on the township of Horton here. It's about sort of 5 miles north of Newcastle. So these are boundaries depicted on the first edition OS map, which you can kind of see underneath this. That conform to within 20 degrees of underlying slope. So you can see most of that field pattern in there does conform to within 20 degrees of underlying slope. Same township boundary. These are the ones that are mapped on the first edition OS map, which do not conform to within 20 degrees of underlying slope, which obviously, as you can see, apart from this little block up here, there's far less. So when we pull that together and look at it on top of a DTM, which shows the sort of relief of that area, you can see that this ridge along here seems to be like this sort of pivot from which boundaries and other units of landscape units have been orientated to, and that goes for, sorry about all these codes here, this is all the codes that I had to use for the GIS, but so rectilinear settlements, which we've got one here, one here, one here, that they all conform to within the underlying slope. These are the orientations of them. So as you can see, that a lot of over a long period of time, you've got the medieval ridge and furrow as well. Post-medieval ridge and furrow, you've got this common orientation that's been adhered to, which seems to be locked in to the lie of the land, I suppose. Just to give another take on conformity, this is showing Cramlington Township, which is right next door to Horton Township, which we just looked at, and you've got a lower density of boundaries conforming to underlying slope, and the red, which do not conform to within 20 degrees of underlying slope, make up the general field pattern of this township. And I suppose it's worth thinking, why are there more that don't conform within this township, and the township sort of orientated. I mean, I'm clutching at straws to touch there, but the general lines of which this township are orientated on, they are of a certain orientation, and they seem to stuck to it regardless of underlying slope. I get that a lot of these boundaries it could be from parliamentary enclosure and things like that, which are commonly known to just cut through everything regardless of underlying slope. They are in this study area anyway. So the most common orientations for boundaries and tracts depicted on the first edition OS map in southeast Northumberland were found to be around 10 or 170 and 80 degrees, as you can see from this graph. And that's kind of borne out a little bit in the previous image that I showed you of Cramlington Township, but that's taken the whole data set, the 200,000 data points, and running this analysis on them. That's what it looks like on a map. So you can see there's across the entire study area there are large amounts of that orientation. From these are boundaries depicted on the first edition OS map. When we look at the boundaries and tracts that were transcribed from excavation data, so in terms of the ancient boundaries, the late Iron Age, Romano-British boundaries, we've got a greater density towards the 20 and 30 degrees or 120 degrees. This is just a little snapshot of where we've got some at, I'll come back to this case study in a sec, but this is about 5 miles north of Newcastle again, a place called Wide Open. These are the boundaries that were excavated. So you've got this general slope direction, the general orientation there, which is kind of borne out in the graph. I guess this started me thinking about various ideas of Solskift and Sunwise directions that are commonly talked about in studies of prehistoric houses, for example, in prehistoric roundhouses, the entrances, what are they oriented to, and this is where I was in danger of going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but I wanted to just keep on the data, try and keep as close to the data as I could. But obviously I was drawing on other studies like this landscape in Dorset with a common orientation, which conforms with my graph that I just showed you there. So this is what that orientation looks like on the map for the whole study area. You've got clusters knocking around across the study area with gaps as well in between, obviously because there are every orientation's been accounted for in this, but it's picking out the ones that are most common. Just to make a quick note on this line here is the Devil's Causeway Roman Road, which more or less, the general line of it conforms to those orientations. So again, we can pick out areas where there's more commonality to that. I think it's worth noting that it's not across the board, but this started me thinking, well, okay, they don't always conform to the underlying slope direction, and a lot of the Iron Age boundaries do conform with these are any of these boundaries the result of some sort of endurance from previous land use that have somehow survived into sort of the early modern and present landscape. So just to go back to that wide open, the area we just looked at north of Newcastle, these are the Iron Age enclosures that have been excavated or mapped from remote sensing imagery. This is, oh, sorry, I think I've just zoomed in there. I don't know how I've done that. Oh dear. Yeah, so you've got the...
Sorry, Dave, not to interrupt. Sorry, Dave,
yeah.
Not to interrupt, but we've just to warn you that you've sort of overrunning your 20 minutes and we have got
right.
another talk.
I've only got...
So
sorry.
You're probably nearly at the end anyway, but just another couple of minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up. No problem.
But we can see the screen again.
So just to wrap up, you've got... I'll just come back to this image. So you've got the 30 or 120 degrees, which kind of you can see lines coming through here. Is this something that survived? These lines here, these the remnants of an earlier field systems that have endured into today's landscape. You've got this outlier here of an Iron Age enclosure that conforms with a different orientation. So is this, could this be a later Roman period enclosure? It's never been excavated, this one. It conforms with sort of the later pattern of fields, potentially later pattern of fields in there. So that's just putting everything on top of each other there, looking at it sort of comparatively. So I'll just quickly wrap up. Sorry, I'd lost track of time there. So yeah, in terms of, this is where it sort of the data sort of starts to play tricks on you. The rectilinear enclosures there, the main orientation for those is 90 degrees, which obviously goes against a lot of the ancient boundaries, which were 30 and 120. My research looked into drainage and access to the sun and slope conformity in that sense. And really, my research really opened up a bit of a can of worms of, well, there's a lot more needs to be done, which I suppose a lot of people's research projects do. So I'd like to have done a bit more on this beyond Northumberland and looked at other places where there's amazing data that we're getting all the time now. So yeah, if I could remember how to do that model again, as I showed you later, I would like to pick it up one day when I'm old and grey and have another look at it. But yeah, that's it from me. Sorry for running over, but thanks for your time.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much, Dave. Really, really interesting. And yeah, sorry to cut you short. I was just trying to make sure we've got time to hear from Jessica as well. But really, really interesting. But I think we'll just move straight into Jessica's talk, if that's all right, Jessica, and you're ready. And then if you've got any questions or anything for Dave, then please do pop them in the chat or just raise your hand at the end, and we'll just have a quick Q&A session at the end. But yeah, Jessica, if you're all right to go ahead, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
So hopefully I'm starting to share.
Yes, that's great.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, grand. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. And I am painfully aware that forestry and landscape is like a massive subject. So what I've tried to do is break this down into bite-sized chunks, given it's lunchtime. And and don't want to be presumptive, but if there's particular subjects that are of interest, because I've gone very broad and I've gone very general as sort of an introduction to forestry and landscape and our thinking within the Forestry Commission. So if there's particular topics within this that are of interest, I would be very happy to come back and explore things in more detail. And then also I have to apologise to those people that attended the Algeo Countryside Committee meeting last week. There's a couple of duplicates. You'll have seen some of these slides before. I'm just going to go over some of those basic numbers again, but there's some other stuff you haven't seen. So stay tuned if you were in that meeting. It's still worth being here. So anyway, my name's Jessica Turner. I am one of the 2 national historic environment advisors for the Forestry Commission, and we sit within a team of 9. And we have area historic environment advisors embedded with all the area teams to help address historic environment and historic landscape considerations within forestry proposals. So I'm going to move on quickly and talk just basically why we're here, what we're doing, and the regulation that underlies everything that we do. So the Forestry Commission was formed in 1919, post First World War, in response to our diminished timber supplies. We had less than 5% tree cover at that stage and very insecure timber supply. That was, it was a national emergency, and this was this country's response to it was forming the Forestry Commission. Now, various forestry acts have come and gone, but the important one that we all need to bear in mind is the 1967, which describes the function of the Forestry Commission. And really, the important thing in this is it controls felling. And this means that when a tree is cut down, we control that process, and it's done via license. And the license will be a conditional license. When somebody applies for a felling license, it's a conditional license, and that condition is to restock. And that's something that we need to really bear in mind. So regulation dictates that when deforestation happens, we expect those sites to be reforested. There should be no net loss of trees in this country. That's a really important and fundamental thing to bear in mind when thinking about forestry. So I thought it would be worth just touching on what the definition of woodland and forestry is. So it is something that's greater than 20% tree canopy cover. So it's got to be over 5 hectares to be woodland, and it has to be a minimum of 20 metres wide. So anything smaller, hedgerows, individual parkland trees, they're not woodland and they don't fall within our remit. Now, what's interesting is to think about what that actually looks like in terms of density, in terms of what a woodland looks like when you're in it and when you're creating woodland. So typical density rates that we look at would be 1,100 stems per hectare. So trees would be about 3 metres apart if we're looking at that sort of stocking rate. 1,600 stems per hectare, sort of a medium density, would be about 2.5 metres between trees. And then the higher density would be 2,200 plus stems per hectare, and they're spaced at about 2 metres. Now, increased density means we get straighter timber, which obviously has benefits in terms of it, but also sort of accounts for attrition and failure rates as well. And that, a part of managing a woodland is that you'll go in periodically and thin to help those stronger trees, grow up and be good. Another thing to bear in mind, it's got an interesting factor about forestry is the economics of forestry. I'm sure we've all been to the local garage and you've seen those bags of kiln dried wood for about a tiny bag is about £20 upwards. And so I think this all gives us this notion that there's a lot of money in forestry, but the actual economics of it from a forester's point of view is pretty tight. And actually, when we're looking at tree felling and we're looking at the value of a trunk, a large class A high valued class A timber, trunk of that at roadside, so it's been felled and it's been stacked, they sell for about £30 per trunk. So the two don't equate. What we're paying as customers out at the garage doesn't equate for what the timber is when it's sold. And that £30 has to account for harvesting and labour and stacking and machinery. So it is basically an economy of scale when it comes to forestry and forest management. Just to give you a picture of some of the sort of complexities of forest management. Now, I don't need to lecture anybody here about climate change, the climate emergency that we're in. But again, it's another really interesting thing for us. We've all read the IPCC reports and things like that, and we know we're in a climate emergency. And planting trees is one of a suite of mitigation options that are open to us and that the government supports. And I'm not saying it's the only answer, but it's one of them. And Section 1 of the Environment Act 2020 has now put a statutory duty on us to increase woodland and tree canopy cover to 16.5% by 2050. And I thought it might be interesting for you to see how that's translating in our sort of performance indicators. So I've put a quick graph up here of where we're at. So you can see from 2021, we've had a steady increase in tree planting, and we're now at about over 7,000 hectares were planted 24-25. That equates roughly to about 10.4 million trees. Now, we're at now with the 10.4 million trees, probably about 13% tree canopy cover now. So we're still looking at another 13.5% increase in tree canopy cover by 2050. That is a big, big ask. And that, elephant in the room, that is going to mean landscape change. And I think we have to acknowledge that. So what we're doing at the Forestry Commission is trying to mitigate that, or at least ensure that, you'll all heard this line before, the right tree in the right place, and that's what we're trying to do. And we do that through a variety of things, particularly from the historic environment point of view. It's looking at information and data, and ensuring that we can make the right decisions about which tree goes where. The other thing to bear in mind is also, I thought you might be interested to see this figure. Overwhelmingly, the planting is permanent native broadleaf. So as you can see, 88% of the trees that were planted last year, of those 7,000 plus hectares, are broadleaf, native broadleafs. We are increasing our conifer production. So that's gone up to 12%, which is really encouraging. And conifers can work in the landscape in the right place. And we do need them if you just, the political economic climate at the moment with trouble in sort of Eastern Europe, sort of stresses how important it is that we do have our own secure timber supply. So we have to look at sustainable timber for the nation going forward. So this is reflected in the numbers as well, and it is encouraging, but it's good to see that also 88% are permanent. So as I say, this is going to be big landscape change. Getting the right tree in the right place will mitigate sort of that negative impact. So I just thought I'll talk about the Forestry Commission's approach to the historic environment and on the back of that, landscape as well. So in forestry, we don't work to NPPF, we work to the UK Forestry Standard, and we're on the 5th edition, which was published in October 2024, and it sets out the government's approach to sustainable forestry. A historic environment is one of 8 elements of sustainable forest management. And one of the other elements is landscape. So landscape and historic, landscape character is in there, and it's a really important consideration. So UKFS is the basis for our regulation and our monitoring. It contains 4 legal requirements, 5 good practice requirements, and 24 good practice guidelines. Good practice requirements 1 to 3 relate to historic landscape character, and 1 to 3 of the good practice guidelines relates to historic landscape context. So historic landscape character is really at the forefront of what we're thinking and we're trying to do in the Forestry Commission. We're very mindful that there's an awful lot of information for applicants and people to take on. So my colleague David Robinson, who's the other national lead, has been busy drafting guidance. We published some guidance to go alongside this UKFS historic environment chapter, but we're also drafting some supplementary guidance notes, again, looking at those landscape issues. And ridge and furrow was the first one that David has tackled, and good for him. And the guidance is drafted internally, lots of to and fro. It's now out for its first round of consultation with both the heritage and forest sectors. And we anticipate publication of this supplementary guidance towards the end of the year, hopefully by December. And we're going to look at other sort of hot topics or themes that come up regularly within proposals. So maybe designed landscapes, military sites, airfields, things like that. Those sort of landscape scale things, we're going to provide more supplementary guidance notes when it comes to woodland creation and forestry and woodland management with these particular features. So that's our ambition going forward. We've also published a new historic environment opportunity map for new woodland, and this is part of our bigger historic environment data sets project. And we've done some classifications of favourable, neutral, unsuitable, very careful not to use terminology that is presumptive in relation to planting or not planting, but I'll come into a little bit more detail on that. Obviously, I'm going to rush through this, sorry. And also another thing to help us is we've been commissioning some research. So we commissioned Oxford Archaeology to do this brilliant bit of research for us to help inform our thinking. And it was based on the basics, what is the impact of tree roots on archaeology? And actually, what Oxford Archaeology did, they looked through they did literature review in this first phase, including grey literature, and actually very little direct sort of references to tree roots was within the literature came out as quite an obvious thing. But it's not saying that there isn't impact. Basically 90% of roots are in the top 60% of the soil cap. So it's interesting things like that came out of it. But Oxford Archaeology has suggested a second phase, and it's ground truthing, and we're about to start doing that this summer. So that's another bit. So this is it's just gathering this information, informing our decisions, so we're going to make the right decision about the right tree in the right place. So forestry and landscape, now I'll get onto the tablet that I'm doing. What are we doing going forward? Again, so we're talking about, I have mentioned we are going to be looking at large scale landscape change if we're going to increase to 16.5% tree cover. So we've got a work in progress at the moment is we're looking at ZTVs, which is zones of theoretical visibility. So taking that sort of rather flat GIS view sheds that we've traditionally been doing, and just getting some sort of terrain and elevation modelling into it, so that we can start looking at the impact of trees, not only in heights and contours, but in time depth as well. So we could look at the impact as the trees grow over time. So we're doing some work on that. Excuse the rather simple sort of schematic here, but this is just to give you an idea of what we could do. And then we're also looking at then how we map that and take into account views and vistas and get that sort of digitally and mapped so that we can fully understand the impact of woodland creation in this first instance on historic environment assets, but we can roll this out on a much sort of wider landscape scale thing as well, to look at views and vistas, all those sorts of important things we need to consider when looking at woodland creation. I thought I'd touch very briefly on the classifications we've put into the opportunity map, again, because this has sort of landscape implications, or we've used landscape scale data. So what's been interesting is we've managed to create a lost historic woodland, and that's the one sort of theme that comes out as favourable in terms of a good planting opportunity. The way we did that is we used an AI data set, which was done by ArcAI, who mapped basically using AI historic woodland on the 2nd edition OS map. Then we took off the NFI, which is the National Forestry Inventory. We took that off of existing woodland, and this gave us a data set of lost historic woodlands. So this is where we think we've got favourable sort of opportunity for woodland creation. So large scale landscape features like World Heritage sites we've put as neutral, because we need people to consider that there is a consideration when it comes to the historic environment and landscape in these places, but the scale of those means that perhaps we can see it as a neutral rather than as unsuitable. And then we've gone into a lot more detail in the unsuitable. So ridge and furrow, we used historic landscape characterization. Some like salt marsh, scree, we've used it for that sort of to take out landscape types that are not suitable for woodland creation. We have shine inventory in there with those authorities that have shared that with us, and then the registered designated assets, so registered parks and gardens, battlefields, scheduled monuments, and buffers. And then we have a grey area. We have 2 grey areas, those areas that without data. Now, we haven't said they're suitable because obviously, as we know, evidence of absence is not absence of evidence. So we've put those as grey, just basically we don't have the data. What this looks like in map form, hopefully you can see this, is you can see that there's quite a lot of green. So we can see a lot of potential for recreating woodland. There was woodland there in the past, and we can create woodland there now. There's dual benefits to that, from a landscape character. It is going to be easier to sort of fit because there has been the wood in there in the past, but also potentially we've got seed sources in that landscape depending on what's happened subsequently. So there's a huge potential there. And the difference here, you can see dark grey and light grey. Light grey is where we have shine data, and you can see a lot more unsuitable pinks showing up in that area because we have the shine data showing. And in the dark grey, we don't have shine data, and as you can see, we haven't got so much unsuitable showing in those areas. We've also got a parkland data set. Now, caveat, this is another AI data set, so it has its limitations. But we commissioned an AI data set to look at, to detect the grassland element, the stippled element of parkland on the second OS edition map. And it's been a really, really interesting exercise because what I've put up here, I put the National Heritage data set. So it's just a screenshot of the Historic England map. And you can see this is just north of Taunton. And you can see Hestercombe Gardens just above Taunton. And then 2 other designated landscapes further, Crowcombe, and I can't remember the name of the one. So that's what's designated in terms of registered parks and gardens. So again, looking at this landscape scale and how woodland fits into that. Now, we're conscious that obviously not all parklands are registered, and most are on HERs, but there might be others that are formed through. So we commissioned an AI data set to look at that. And this is the same sort of patch of lands. You can just see Hestercombe. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I've got my cursor on Hestercombe now, which is just above Taunton. And you can see the other woodland there that's designated, and then Crowcombe up there in the corner there. The starkness, the difference here, what's interesting about this is, so the green stippled areas showing on the OS map are the parkland detections that AI has come up with. And you can see, obviously, it's not comparable to what's designated and what's undesignated, but it's actually, there's a wealth of data out there relating to parklands. Lots of local historic environment services will have this data, but we wanted a map that we could refer to this. This is used in-house to help woodland officers, woodland creation officers, and our own historic environment staff identify where there's potential for historic landscapes. So it's just to give you a contrast to those things. What's interesting is 44,000 hectares are registered parkland, but our detection has 311,000 hectares of parkland detection. So technically that's 267 hectares of undesignated parkland that we've now got in this data set. I know that Natural England have also been working on historic parkland data sets, and it'll be a really interesting exercise to compare those two things. I really need to stress this is AI learning, so there's a lot of sort of issues with it in terms of it's very basic. It's not backed up with the data and research that you would expect on the National Heritage List, but it's a really useful tool for us when considering landscapes and forestry in those sorts of landscapes. Sorry, I should say that data set, whilst licensing isn't open data at the moment, it is available on the National Library of Scotland. There's a link there at the bottom of this screen, so worth looking at as well. As I say, there's some issues with it just picking up the grassland element, and as you can see here, nice bit of parkland grass, but obviously it's not picked up the woodland, and it's not picked up the copses where the trees sit, don't have the stippled effect underneath. So it has its limitations, but it's a useful tool that we're looking at. So I think we're running out of time. Right, so I just thought we would just touch on very briefly, very quickly, on legacy and succession. Again, parklands and design landscapes, it's a massive chapter in our UKFS, but it's something that we've got all these tools and this guidance to help us protect these important landscapes. But we also need to start talking about legacy and succession. And we associate these landscapes with these majestic, mature trees, but we need to acknowledge that some parks and gardens, as demonstrated on that previous slide, were the whim of one generation and have completely disappeared now. We don't have anything left to keep hold of or to enhance. But we also have to talk about how these parklands, a lot of these trees are coming to full maturity, and we need to be looking at ways of replacing and succession in these landscapes to ensure that we can preserve the character. And as I've talked about earlier, forestry and that definition of forestry is not the answer in these landscapes, but we do have an interesting development within sort of woodland creation, and that's agroforestry, which is giving us an opportunity to look at much lower density planting, like lower density planting, very low density planting in agroforestry is probably 30 to 50 stems per hectare. So you can see the massive difference in what we can achieve, but it's still getting trees in the ground. We could still look at succession. So this is at Alnwick Castle, and you can see a majestic oak there in the foreground. And then just to the side of it, to the left, you can see they've put in succession, that they've got their succession planting in close by, so that you've got that evolving landscape. That's a really important thing. These are living and evolving landscapes, and we have to work out a way of looking after these places. And, you know, woodland creation does have its place in these landscapes. And then I just thought I would finish this very quickly with an interesting sort of question and the sort of things that we end up having to look at within the Forestry Commission. And this also illustrates a really important point about how these proposals come to us. These applications for woodland creation, they come from the landowner, the land agent, the farmer. It's not the Forestry Commission going out saying you should plant trees here. Obviously, we promote schemes and we promote the ethos of trees are a good idea, but we're not the people going out making decisions where these trees go. We've got all this maps and all this guidance to help people make appropriate decisions, but it's really not up to us. So this is a really good example of something that's not up to us. This is obviously a designed landscape, a capability brown landscape, and it came complete with a very comprehensive, really good parkland management plan. That parkland management plan suggests the removal of those 2 conifer blocks. I don't know if you can see my cursor in the middle of the grassland element here. And, you know, from a purist historic environment point of view, absolutely, that really works. That's restoring that landscape. Absolutely support that. But what was incredibly interesting is those 2 conifer blocks were planted by the landowner's father. And he had a real affinity and tenderness towards those conifer blocks. He can remember them being planted. So he's appreciating a heritage, not the timeline that's, you know, celebrated in the parkland management plan, but his personal family and that evolution of that landscape. So he doesn't want to fell those. And then even if he did want to fell those, the regulation dictates that there should be no net loss of woodland. So traditionally that would come with a conditional felling license and we would expect him to restock it. But because it's in this parkland, we would then be asking for compensatory planting for something he doesn't even want to fell. He would like to restock because it's part of his family's legacy. And then everything outside of the parkland is prime agricultural land. So this is the balance that we need to strike. So there should be no net loss, but we need to celebrate and look after these evolving landscapes, but protect the historic environment at the same time. I realise I've really rushed through that. So have you got any questions?